Okay, thank you very much. Well, I don't have to speak that loudly after all. Well, welcome to the second of the Gay Hart Gaines Distinguished Visiting Fellow of American History for 2016 lectures with our wonderful Rick Brookhiser. I'm really happy to welcome Rick back again. He's not only a brilliant scholar, he's a brilliant communicator, and he knows the founders intimately. He received an honorary degree from Washington College, a doctorate degree in 2005. And in 2008, President George W. Bush awarded him the National Humanities Medal at a wonderful ceremony at the White House. As I told you in my first introduction, when I'm asked about what book I love of George Washington, it's hard to pick just one, but I almost always tell them, be sure you read Rick Brookhiser's Founding Father, because, especially if they're not George Washington scholars, because it's just so readable and it's so charged and packed with good information. But I also recommend one of his books, What Would the Founders Do? And if I could send it to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, I would. I think every presidential candidate should read it. Brookhiser wrote, and I quote, "Books can both express thoughts we already have and stimulate us to have new ones." His book, Founder's Son, A Life of Abraham Lincoln, is another one of my favorites. It was published in 2015, and I didn't read it until last summer, but I couldn't put it down. It's a fascinating inquiry into Lincoln's self-education. He was searching for an inspirational and emotional replacement for a taciturn father who made him work until he was 21 without any pay, and he really didn't like him very much. He turned to Washington and the writings of the great men of the founding era, including the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, for guiding inspiration and purpose throughout his life. The fathers that Lincoln took to heart and showed him how to be a great man were our founding fathers. In his second annual address to Congress, Lincoln said, quote, "We cannot escape history. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope on earth." I am feeling those thoughts right now in this presidential cycle. He was totally self-taught, but one of the greatest and most educated of American presidents. Rick Brookhiser's research concludes that Abraham Lincoln was the true inheritor of the founders' mantle, bringing their vision to bear on the Civil War and the question of slavery. Rick wrote, quote, "Lincoln drew on them for inspiration and wrapped himself in their aura." I think that's what we all try to do here at Mount Vernon, and that is to wrap ourselves in the aura of George Washington. So, ladies and gentlemen, read the book, and now welcome for the second time, Rick Brookhiser.
Well, thank you, Gay, for another splendid introduction, and thank you all for coming out. The sun has gone down, so I guess the Jewish New Year has ended. And so I thought, naturally, of the letter that Washington wrote the Hebrew congregation at Newport. After his first inauguration, he got letters of congratulation from virtually every private or civic group in the country. And these were overwhelmingly from religious groups, because there wasn't a lot else going on in the United States then. And that meant that they were almost all Protestant churches. But the Catholics and the Jews pitched in too, and the Truro Synagogue in Newport sent one of these letters to the new president. And in it they congratulated him on his election, and also said what an excellent thing it was that the new nation embraced religious toleration. And in his reply to the Truro Synagogue, Washington gives a gentle correction to them. He says, it is no more that toleration is spoken of, as it was by the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean or consider and behave themselves as good citizens in giving to it on all occasions their effectual support. And I love that letter because it has Washington's quality of saying something with such directness and forcefulness that it becomes obvious. So these Gaines lectures track both George Washington and the American political system, from the eve of his first presidential election all the way through the Civil War. And we ended the last lecture with George Washington's farewell address, which he printed in a Philadelphia newspaper, and then it was picked up all around the country in September of 1796, when he announced that he would not stand for a third presidential election. And in it, he said, "Let me now warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. This spirit exists under different shapes in all governments, but in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy." Well, it was too late. It was already too late. The spirit of party had already taken hold here, and the election that followed showed it. Fisher Ames, who was a congressman from Massachusetts, said that Washington's farewell address was like someone dropping a hat to signal the beginning of a horse race. And the two jockeys were John Adams, the vice president, and Thomas Jefferson, the former Secretary of State. The race between them was bitter, it was partisan, and it was sectional. Adams won every electoral vote in New England, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. Jefferson won every electoral vote in Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, and all but one each in Virginia and North Carolina. The final tally was 71 for Adams, 68 for Jefferson. And under the Constitution of that day, before the 12th Amendment, this meant that John Adams would be the president and his defeated rival, Jefferson, would be the vice president. But these two men had been friends for years ago. They had served together in the Continental Congress. Jefferson had called Adams our colossus on the floor for his eloquence in arguing for independence. And Adams had suggested that Jefferson be the man to write the Declaration of Independence. Then after the Revolution, they served as diplomats in Europe, Adams in London, Jefferson in Paris. Jefferson was a widower, but he liked Adams's wife, Abigail, who very much liked him. Jefferson knew Adams's son, John Quincy Adams. The Adamses knew Jefferson's daughters. They had once been very close. So at the end of this election year, December 28th, Jefferson writes his old friend a letter. "The public and the public papers have been much occupied lately in placing us in a point of opposition to each other.
Yes, sir. Sorry about that.
All right. I confidently trust we have felt less of it ourselves. That your administration may be filled with glory and happiness is my sincere prayer." Jefferson sent this letter unsealed to James Madison. Madison wrote back in the new year, January 15th, and he told him, "Don't send this." One of his reasons was, "The zealous and active promoters of your election might feel depreciated." In other words, we've just had a big fight. A lot of people have supported you. What will they think if you send compliments to the man they've been struggling against? His second point was there may be real embarrassments from giving written possession to Adams of his high opinion of him. In other words, Adams is going to do things we don't like. We're going to be criticizing him. Do you want to put on paper nice sentiments that he could show to people later? So Jefferson did not send this letter. The election not only split the country, it broke the friendship. And only many years later did the two resume friendly elections. So what I want to cover tonight is how this new world of politics came into being. How did George Washington react to it in the years of his retirement? And then how was his legacy carried on after his death in 1799? So this new world of politics had already begun. It started emerging in Washington's first administration. And I gave a foretaste of that last month. One of the stimuluses of the new spirit of contention was Alexander Hamilton and his financial plans. In the spring of 1790, he had got something he wanted. The federal government assumed the debts of all the states, and it agreed not to discriminate among American creditors. All creditors would be paid off, even if they hadn't been soldiers. But the opponents of his financial plan, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, had also got something they wanted. The capital of the United States would move from New York City to a spot on the Potomac after a 10-year layover in Philadelphia. Then in the spring of 1791, Hamilton proposes a Bank of the United States. This would be a federally chartered bank. It would hold all the money of the United States. It would also be a private institution that would take private deposits and make loans to private citizens. Jefferson and Madison opposed this, partly because they didn't like banks and were suspicious of them, but also because they didn't think it was constitutional. There was nothing in the Constitution about chartering a bank or a corporation, so how could this pass muster? But Hamilton won this argument. Congress passed a bill chartering the bank, and George Washington signed it into law. And this time, Jefferson and Madison had won nothing. So their reaction to this second and worst defeat was to found an opposition political party. And for a political party, you need three things. You need allies, you need advocates, and you need a rationale. The search for allies began in the late spring of 1791, when Jefferson and Madison left the capital, now in Philadelphia, and they went to New York. They took a trip up the Hudson River as far as Lake George. Then they swung over into Vermont. They went down the Connecticut River all the way to Long Island Sound. Madison then took the longest water trip of his life. He crossed the Sound. He wasn't much of a traveler. They got to Long Island and went west back to New York City. And this was an expedition of natural history. They collected specimens of animals and plants. They brought them back to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, which Jefferson was the president of. They shot squirrels. They investigated the Hessian fly, which was a grain pest. And Jefferson wrote a letter to one of his daughters on a piece of bark sitting in a canoe on Lake George. And I am kind of stunned by the number of biographers of Jefferson and Madison who really accept the notion that this was all that was going on, that they were really just out to enjoy and study the beauties of nature. But some of the people who were alive at the time thought there was more afoot. One of these was Robert Troup, who was a lawyer in New York City, an old friend of Hamilton's. Hamilton was staying in Philadelphia, working hard at the Treasury Department. So Troup writes him and says there is every sign of a passionate courtship between the Chancellor, Burr, Jefferson, and Madison. Now, the chancellor is Robert Livingston, the chief judge of the Court of Chancery of New York State. Livingston was the man who had administered the oath of office to Washington in his first inauguration. He was one of the wealthiest, largest landowners in New York State. Aaron Burr was a youngish lawyer in New York, Revolutionary War vet. He was also a brand new senator from New York State. And the passionate courtship that was going on is the search for allies. If you want to have a political party, it can't just be in one state. You want peers in other states and other parts of the country. And this is what Jefferson and Madison were looking for. They could take care of business in Virginia, but they wanted helpers elsewhere, and particularly in New York. Troup ended his letter by saying, "Delenda est Carthago" is the motto with respect to you. Now, in those days, every gentleman knew Latin, but you don't have to know a lot of Latin to understand that one. It was the old Roman slogan, "Carthage must be destroyed." The second thing you need for a political party is advocates. You don't want your principals to be doing all the talking and the writing and the publicizing. So Madison turned to one of his classmates from the College of New Jersey at Princeton. This was a man named Philip Freneau. Freneau had had kind of a checkered career. He had been a sailor and a ship's captain. He'd done a little teaching. He was also a poet. If you look at very fat anthologies of American poetry, you can still find some poems of Freneau in them. They're pretty good. They were as good as we could do in the 1790s. But Madison introduced Freneau to Jefferson, and Jefferson gave him a no-show job at the State Department. His job was to be a translator of documents in foreign languages. Of course, Thomas Jefferson didn't need translation. He was fluent in several of them. And he assured Freneau that he would have enough time to do whatever else a gentleman might wish. What they wished Freneau to do was to edit a newspaper in Philadelphia called the National Gazette. There was already a newspaper which tended to support the administration. It was called the Gazette of the United States. It printed all the government advertisements. That was one way to get the favor of a newspaper in those days. If you were the administration, you'd give them the contract for printing your laws and so on. But the National Gazette was going to be an oppositional newspaper. Madison sold subscriptions for it in Virginia, and the first issue came out on Halloween of 1791. The third thing you need for a political party, it's not just enough to have major players and to have minor players. They also have to have a rationale. Why are they banded together? What are they doing? What do they aim for? And Madison set out the rationale for this new party in a series of essays that he wrote in Freneau's paper from the fall of 1791 to the spring of 1792. These essays are much less famous, much less well read than the Federalist Papers. And that's partly a matter of quality. They're very short, they're very simple. I would almost say simple-minded. You get the sense that Madison is writing down. But he's not writing for the ages or for immortality. He's writing to make some basic political points and to lay out principles and plans for a new political party. Some of the principles are peace. This was going to be a party of peace. He also said it's going to be a party of farmers. He said the cities are the homes of bridewells and bedlams. A bridewell was a big London prison. Bedlam was a big London madhouse. You didn't have crime or madness in the country, apparently. You only had those in the cities. He also said that the enemies of the new party, or the people that the new party was designed to counteract, were the opulent. Now, Madison and Jefferson were Virginia planters, so they were plenty opulent themselves. But their wealth came from land and from owning people, so that was okay. But the people he had in mind as the opulent were Hamilton's banker friends, who made money by buying long and selling short and buying futures and doing all these mysterious operations on Wall Street, which already existed even in the 1790s. But the most important thought that Madison had in these essays, and the reason that we should still pay attention to them, is he introduced to the American mind the concept of public opinion. The public opinion was a new phrase and a new concept. It had only been expressed 20 years earlier in France, and James Madison is one of the very first people in the English language to use that phrase in a modern sense. And this is his last discovery as a political scientist as to what the guarantee of America's rights are. When Madison is writing the Federalist Papers, he says it's the division of the government, it's the checks and balances, it's the division into states versus federal, and Congress versus the president versus the courts. But now he has another safeguard, which is public opinion. He says that there should be a paramount empire of reason that spreads over the whole country, and that every citizen should become a sentinel over the rights of every other citizen. So he's imagining a community of thought and feeling instructed by newspapers like the National Gazette, which will have citizens constantly thinking about political matters and watching out for their rights and communicating with each other, and also communicating with their leaders, receiving ideas from them, giving their reactions to their leaders. It's a 24/7 loop of political activity. Now, this was a new idea. It's not the way most other Americans yet thought of politics. Certainly wasn't the way George Washington thought of it. In Washington's mind, of course, the people ruled, but they ruled at election time. And then those who won served for 2 years or 4 or 6 or however long their terms were. And then they would stand, if they didn't resign, for another election. And again, the people would rule. If they liked the job they did, they would re-elect them. If they didn't, they would elect someone else. But in between, those who had been elected would do their jobs as assigned by the Constitution. Washington uses a phrase after the Whiskey Rebellion when he's criticizing some political societies which he believed had encouraged it. He called them self-created. And this strikes us as very odd as a critical term, which it was, because we're awash in self-created societies. There are hundreds of them. The largest ones have permanent offices in Washington. They do lobbying for all sorts of causes, from tiny favors for businesses to issues of vast importance. And we expect this and we accept it. But it was a new concept then, new to Washington, being generated by James Madison and his influence on public opinion. Madison also named the new party. He called it the Republican Party. It still exists. It's now called the Democratic Party. It changed its name in the 1830s. The Republican Party we have today was founded in the 1850s. It's a completely different organization. But it's the second oldest party in the world after the Tories of England. Now, a second party also emerged to contend with the Republicans, and this took the name Federalists. The most important advocate it had was Alexander Hamilton, both when he was Secretary of Treasury and even after he retired. Hamilton had done journalism when he was a teenager in the Virgin Islands. He continued to do it all his life. He really had a knack for it. And he was really irrepressible. In one newspaper fight, Thomas Jefferson, who's looking at him from the other side, did say admiringly that Hamilton was a host within himself. All by himself, he was a host. And one of Hamilton's own allies, Fisher Ames, the congressman I mentioned earlier, he said of one of Hamilton's series of essays, this was to defend a treaty that the Washington administration had negotiated, he said, "Jove's eagle is no longer throwing its thunderbolts at titans, but at sparrows and mice." In other words, give it a rest. You've already won. You've already persuaded ourselves. But that was Hamilton's personality. Another Federalist journalist was a man named William Cobbett. He was an Englishman who had to leave England. He'd been in the army and he'd made charges of corruption and he had to flee the country. So he'd been a radical in England, but then he came over here and he became quite conservative. He became a Federalist journalist, and ultimately he went back to England where he became a radical again. So I think what he mainly wanted to be was oppositional wherever he was. But Cobbett is actually, he's a good writer. You can actually read him and enjoy him, which is not true of a lot of the polemics of the 1790s. One of Cobbett's little thrusts was, "Happy Virginia, thrice happy Carolina, where the virtuous Democrat, after singing hymns to liberty, gets him home with his property indoors, nay, sometimes in his very arms." So this was Cobbett's little slap at the slave-owning members of the Republican Party. So the two parties were up and running, beginning in Washington's first term, and certainly full throttle by his second term. He steps down, and the election to succeed him had the result that I've just explained. So how does Washington deal with this new political world after he's warned against it in his farewell address? Well, he joins it. He's one of the last founders to embrace the new partisanship, but he does. I think by his death, it's fair to say that he considers himself a Federalist. Part of it, I think, is maybe retirement. The burden of full responsibility is off his shoulders, so maybe he can let some certain pent-up feelings come out. There's also a war scare in the last years of his life. And Washington had already fought in 2 world wars, and he saw a third possibly coming to the United States. And the source of danger this time was revolutionary France. The Reign of Terror had ended. The Jacobins who had guillotined so many were guillotined themselves, and they were replaced by a regime that was called the Directory, which was much easier on Frenchmen. Aristocrats could come out of hiding. They deliberately wore ill-fitting clothes to remind people of how they'd been on the run and under concealment. The fashion was called, if you wore these clothes, you were called les incroyables. You were incredible because the clothes ill-fit so much. Young ladies would wear red bands around their necks. It was just a way of saying, well, you didn't get us, but we'll wear a red band to remind you of what you were doing. But it wasn't all jokes. Alexis de Tocqueville's parents had been imprisoned during the Reign of Terror. They survived it. But for all the rest of his life, his father would take a nap at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because that was the hour when the jailers came to haul you out to be killed. And he couldn't be alive at that time, or he couldn't be awake at that time ever again. So the Directory was good for Frenchmen, but it was bad for everyone else. It was aggressive and it was greedy. It pursued a very forward foreign policy in Europe. One of its young generals was Napoleon Bonaparte. And it also began seizing American ships because they were trading with Britain, the traditional enemy of France, now all the more so because of its opposition to the French Revolution. The United States sent 3 commissioners over to France to try and straighten things out, but after meeting the foreign minister, whose name was Talleyrand, for about 15 minutes, they found they could never get a second appointment. And who came instead were mysterious intermediaries who essentially told them they had to pay bribes. They needed to pay a bribe to France, a big one, and they also needed individual bribes to all the diplomats involved before any talks could get going. One of the Frenchmen said, "We need something for the pocket." And this is a very old comedy. It's Innocents Abroad. And one of the Americans, Charles Pinckney from South Carolina, he exclaimed at one point, "No, no, not a sixpence." And when word of this toast got back to the United States, this became a slogan: millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. So France was bullying us. France was behaving very badly. There were fears of a French invasion, and George Washington agreed to come out of retirement and put on a uniform for one last time. He was reinstated as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. He said he wasn't going to serve actively until and unless French troops arrived, but he was willing to take the rank and to prepare a defense against such a thing happening. He also took political steps because he saw the Republican Party as pro-French and something that had to be combated if America was to defend itself. So he summoned in September of 1798 2 young men to Mount Vernon, and he was going to urge them to run for Congress. One of them was his nephew, Bushrod Washington, son of his brother John Augustine Washington. He was a highly respected lawyer at the time. He lived in Westmoreland County. The second young Federalist that Washington called on was John Marshall. Marshall had been born in 1755. He was the eldest child of a large family. He was born in Northern Virginia, which was then the frontier. His father intended him to be a lawyer. Thomas Marshall, the father, was one of the first subscribers to the first edition of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. This was the book every lawyer had to have and understand, and Thomas Marshall, the father, got an early copy of it. But the revolution begins in 1775, and young Marshall goes off to serve. He fights in the Battle of Brandywine, Germantown, where he was shot in the hand, Monmouth, and also in 2 small but nasty engagements around New York, Stony Point and Paulus Hook. He said in later years that it was in the war that he learned to think of America as his country and Congress as its ruler. It was also in the war that he fell in love with George Washington. He became devoted to Washington all his life. He later described Washington's behavior in the fighting for Philadelphia. At one point, Washington is being urged to make an early counterattack on the British. And Marshall explains that Washington didn't want to move just yet. And his description is that Washington had too much firmness of temper, too much virtue and real patriotism to be diverted by the clamors of faction or the discontents of ignorance. Then he has a description of Washington in person, riding out to the troops. The British are making a move. It looks like they're going to attack. The Americans have to ready their defenses. Marshall wrote, "The American chief rode through every brigade of his army, delivering in person his orders, exhorting his troops to rely on the bayonet, and encouraging them by the steady firmness of his countenance, as well as by his words." When Washington surrendered his commission at the end of the war in December of 1783, Marshall wrote a letter in the new year to his old school fellow, James Monroe. "At length, then, the military career of the greatest man on earth is closed. May happiness attend him wherever he goes. When I speak or think of that superior man, my heart overflows with gratitude." So that was the founder that Marshall loved. The founder he hated was his cousin, Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson hated him back. I would almost say that Jefferson hated him a little more, but Marshall really hated Jefferson. Now, I think part of it, how many people here are born and raised in Virginia? Okay, you will have to excuse what I'm now about to say. There is a Virginian thing. Oh, how simple we are. And the richer the Virginian is, the more simple they are. I'm from New York. I just, enough already. But this is the way it's done in Virginia. And certainly Thomas Jefferson did that. I mean, when he is president, he receives guests in soiled trousers and in slippers. One senator mistook him for a servant. I mean, yes, I'm president, but this is just the simple life. But if the contest is simplicity, you can't beat John Marshall. Marshall truly did not care how he dressed. He did not care what he ate. He didn't care if his hair was combed. He was a genial man with no pretensions. The classic story of Marshall, this is in his Richmond years, which was most of his adult life, and he did all his marketing himself. Once a week he'd go to the market. So there's a man who's a newcomer to Richmond, also at the market, and he sees this sturdy peasant standing there, and he says, I've just bought this turkey. Carry it home to my house, will you? So Marshall slings it over his shoulder and follows the guy back to his house, and then the man, pitches him a coin, and Marshall goes off, and then the man's neighbors say, well, the man who just carried your turkey was John Marshall. How Jefferson must have hated that story. And we know that Jefferson hated Marshall's manners. He writes about Marshall's lax, lounging manners. As if that's the only reason Marshall could persuade anyone, because he was lax and lounging. Not that he was, say, smart or right about anything. Then there was an occasion where Jefferson calls on Marshall. This is in Philadelphia when Jefferson's vice president, and he decides he has to make a courtesy call, and Marshall happens to be out, so Jefferson leaves a note. He says, I couldn't see you because fortunately you were out. And then he added on, before the fortunately. Marshall used to say that the first version was the only honest thing that Thomas Jefferson ever wrote. Later, a critical letter that Jefferson wrote about Washington was published in the newspapers, and Marshall said of it that the morals of the author of that letter cannot be pure. And that's Virginian for "you are dead to me." So Thomas Jefferson, in Marshall's view, had schemed behind Washington's back, criticized him behind his back, and that meant there could be no forgiveness ever for Thomas Jefferson. So these are the two Federalists that Washington is urging to run for office. Bushrod agreed very soon. Washington's words to him were, "Bushrod, it must be done." So Bushrod agreed that he would run for Congress. Marshall put up a bit of a fight because he had a growing family and he had a great law practice in Richmond, and he wanted to make money for them. So here's his description of how Washington handled that. "I can never forget the manner in which he treated this objection. He said there were crises in national affairs which made it the duty of a citizen to forego his private for the public interest. We were then in one of them. He detailed his opinions freely on the nature of our controversy with France and expressed his conviction that the best interests of our country depended on the character of the ensuing Congress. He concluded a very earnest conversation by asking my attention to his situation. He had retired from the executive department with the firmest determination never again to appear in a public capacity. Yet I saw him pledged to appear once more at the head of the American army. One account of this story says that Washington had put on his uniform. Marshall concludes, "I yielded to his representations." So, and we have a description of that congressional race in the district that Marshall lived in. Richmond was the main town in it. Marshall was very personally popular there, but he was running against an incumbent, a Republican named John Clopton. So here's an old people's memories of this decades afterwards. The parties were drilled, and their leaders were never surpassed in activity for bringing out every voter. Sick men were taken from their beds to the polls. The halt, the lame, and the blind were hunted up, and every mode of conveyance was mustered into service. Liquor in abundance was on the court green for the friends of either party. A barrel of whiskey for all with the head knocked in, and the majority took it straight. Independent of the political excitement, the liquor added fuel to the flame. Fights became common, and every now and then there would be a knockdown and drag-out affray, to quell which required all the power of the county justices. On this occasion, it was almost impossible to obtain ingress or egress to or from the polls, which were in the courthouse. In truth, none could enter but a voter, and he only with difficulty. The candidates, as was then the custom, were seated on the justice's bench, and it was usual when a vote was cast for the candidate in question to return thanks. Sometimes, "I thank you, sir," sometimes, "May you live 1,000 years." There were several noisy, impudent fellows who made comments on the voters as they came up, sometimes amusing, sometimes insulting. And then the partisans of each would make the welkin ring with their huzzas and animated retorts. Men were shaking fists at each other, rolling up their sleeves, cursing and swearing with angry and furious denunciations. The crowd rolled to and fro like a surging wave. Well, after all this excitement, John Marshall won his seat. Bushrod ended up not running because he got an appointment to the Supreme Court. But the Federalists, partly because of the war scare with France, did very well in that election. However, the wheel turned, as it often does in politics. Washington dies in December of 1799. He went riding to inspect his farms. He was caught in a snowstorm, had some snow on his neck, which he didn't brush off. What he would have read in the newspaper when he got back home was news that James Monroe had just been elected governor of Virginia, and Monroe was a zealous Republican. Now, I don't know if snow on your neck would make inflammation of the throat worse, but certainly Washington dies thinking that the political news has been very bad indeed. Federalists, despite the war scare with France, they were losing popularity. Now, we usually read in history books, textbooks, that it was because of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were Federalist laws that were aimed at Republican-leaning foreigners and newspaper editors, who were often the same people. Journalism pulled for outsiders then as now. But I think an even more important reason was taxes. Because for fear of a French invasion, we had increased the size of the army, and this required increased taxes, and people didn't like it. So when the election of 1800 occurs, the electoral map for the presidency is very similar to 1796, but this time Thomas Jefferson carries New York, not John Adams. So he gets 73 electoral votes to Adams's 65. Congress also, both houses, falls to the Republicans, and they would retain their majorities for decades. Sometimes their majorities would shrink, sometimes they'd go back up, but they never lost control of Congress for decades. Washington, of course, has died, and Alexander Hamilton will be shot and killed in 1804 by Vice President Aaron Burr. But there is one Federalist who remains in a position of great power, and that is the new Chief Justice of the United States, confirmed by the Senate in January 1801, John Marshall. Marshall had been elected to Congress. John Adams liked him very much, made him Secretary of State. Then the Chief Justice, Oliver Ellsworth, announces at the end of 1800 that he's tired and he's ill, he's resigning. Adams offers the job to the man who'd first held it, John Jay. Jay had quit the Supreme Court to become governor of New York, and he wrote back to Adams that he didn't think the job had sufficient dignity, so he wasn't going to take it. So Adams calls Marshall into his office. They're trying to think what to do because Adams is lost. He's a lame duck. Time is running out. He says to Marshall, "Who shall I appoint? Who shall I nominate?" Marshall says, "I don't know, sir." And then Adams looks at him and says, "I believe I shall nominate you," which he did, and the Senate confirms him in January of 1801. So he it is who administers the oath of office to Thomas Jefferson when he is first inaugurated. Now the clash begins. The first move that the victorious Republicans make is the Judiciary Act of 1802. And here they scale back the size of the federal judiciary. Now, in fairness, the Federalists had beefed it up in the Judiciary Act of 1801, another lame duck bill passed after the Republican victory. But there was a problem that had to be addressed, which was that Supreme Court justices in those days also had to ride circuit. They had to serve as circuit court judges. And this was onerous in the extreme. The New England circuit went from Maine to Connecticut. One of the southern circuits was 1,900 miles long. And there were accounts of, one justice's carriage tips over and another justice's wagon bogs down in a river. The accommodations, as you can imagine, were beyond primitive. And the justices complained of this and hoped that Congress would rectify it. And then finally they did in the Judiciary Act of 1801. They created so many circuit court judges that the Supreme Court justices no longer had this additional job. But this was also a Federalist measure to give jobs to Federalists. So the Republicans, coming into power, they passed the Act of 1802, which restores the status quo. So they got rid of the new judges and they required the Supreme Court justices to do circuit duty once again. And Marshall and all his colleagues would continue to do this. This continued until after the Civil War. The second thing they did was impeachment. A senator from Virginia, William Branch Giles, told John Quincy Adams, "We're going to impeach all the justices. We're going to clean out the entire court." And clearly, for Giles, it didn't have to do with high crimes or misdemeanors. It was just house cleaning. We've won. We don't like these guys. We're going to get rid of them and replace them with judges who agree with us. And they were smart about it. They didn't go first for a Supreme Court justice. The first judge to be impeached was a man named John Pickering. He was a federal district court judge in New Hampshire. He'd helped write the Constitution of the state. But by this point in his life, Pickering had lost his mind and he'd become an alcoholic. He was really a pathetic scandal on the bench. So Thomas Jefferson gets some information on Pickering's carrying on, and he sends it on to the House with the note, "This is not within executive cognizance. I transmit it to the House if they shall be of opinion that action must be taken." So he's saying, I'm not doing this, but you should look into this. So Pickering was impeached in 1803, convicted and removed in March of 1804. That very day, the House impeached a justice of the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase. Chase had signed the Declaration of Independence. He was actually quite a good lawyer and a judge, but he was an intemperate man. He could argue with counsel in court. He also liked to give lectures to grand juries. he told a grand jury in Baltimore that universal suffrage would lead to mobocracy. After Jefferson read that, he wrote to another congressman, "Have you seen the extraordinary charge to the grand jury of Baltimore? Ought this seditious and official attack on the principles of the Constitution go unpunished? I ask these questions for your consideration. As for myself, it is better that I should not interfere." So Chase was impeached in March of 1804. Now the Republicans experienced their first check, because the impeachment trial of Chase before the Senate was a debacle. The House manager was a Virginia congressman named John Randolph of Roanoke. He could be a brilliant orator and debater. He was very good at vicious jabs, and he was also very, very funny and smart. But he had no legal training. He was not capable of managing an impeachment. And Chase's lawyers were some of the best, certainly the best Federalist lawyers in America. So the House acquitted Chase on all charges. And so the plan to cleanse the courts by impeachment fell by the wayside. Now, during this time, John Marshall was also pushing back. The first way he pushed back was the biography of George Washington, which he began writing in 1804. Bushrod Washington, his friend, now also their colleagues on the Supreme Court, had inherited Mount Vernon and also all of Washington's papers. The original thought was that the two of them would write the biography, but Bushrod let Marshall do the job. He would just give him the papers to use. And Marshall, like many new authors, thought he would finish the whole thing in half a year. It took him much longer than that. The first volume came out in June of 1804, the fifth, in April of 1807. And his description of some of the early political fights between Federalists and Republicans is actually quite fair. When he describes the fight over the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, he quotes from Jefferson's arguments against it and from Hamilton's arguments for it. And it's really a very informative and well-balanced discussion. But overall, his technique was like that of Samuel Johnson when he was a young reporter of parliamentary debates. The great English writer had done this as a young journalist, and Johnson often had to write the speeches of the parliamentarians because these weren't printed. He might not have been able to get to Parliament to hear them himself. The members of Parliament didn't mind because he wrote better speeches for them than they'd actually given. But Johnson, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Tory, said, you know, he tried to be fair, but he always made sure to let the Whig dogs have the worst of it. And Marshall used the same techniques in his life of Washington. The second instance of Marshall's pushback was the trial for treason of the former Vice President Aaron Burr, which happened in 1807. Now, if any of you ever figure out what Aaron Burr was actually up to in the Western United States, please tell historians, because we have not cracked this nut yet. I think the best guess is that Burr wanted to found Burristan, that he would conquer Texas and perhaps Mexico and set himself up as the ruler of this new country. He also told the ambassadors of Spain and Britain that he would peel off the Western United States. Now, Burr's defenders say, well, that was just talk. That was pretty out there talk. So anyway, Jefferson got wind of these indefinite and shadowy plots. He announced to Congress that Burr's guilt was plain. This was before the man had been tried. And he had him arrested, and his trial occurred in Richmond in the Virginia Circuit, which Marshall presided over as a Supreme Court justice. And this trial, like the impeachment of Chase, was a great defeat for Jefferson and the Republicans. In May Marshall ruled that Jefferson had to produce documents that the defense wanted. This was a supposed description of Burr's plot that had been sent to the president. Burr himself had asked that the president appear, or at the very least that he produce this document, and Marshall ruled that the president would have to do so. And that is still a precedent which is often cited. In September, Marshall closed testimony because nothing was being offered to satisfy the constitutional definition of treason. He construed the Constitution very literally and strictly. And the Constitution says treason can only be proven by a confession in open court or by the testimony of two witnesses to a treasonous act, which must be making war on the United States or giving aid or comfort to its enemies. And this, like the impeachment of Chase, this was a bungled prosecution. The federal government did not have two witnesses to any act of levying war. They might have charged Burr with plotting treason, but that's not what they went to court with. They went with a charge of treason. Marshall cut off the testimony. The jury ruled the only way it could rule, which was to acquit Aaron Burr. But the most important thing, by far the most important thing, that John Marshall does on the Supreme Court is the series of his great decisions. And I don't propose to take you through the jurisprudence of the Marshall Court. We would be here long into the morning. But I just want to read you some selections from important decisions and some selections from the writings of Alexander Hamilton to show the congruence of their thinking. Marshall believed in contracts, he believed in commerce, and he believed in the supremacy of the federal government over the states. This was Alexander Hamilton's financial program and Hamilton's and Washington's political program. And he made sure to be faithful to these on the Supreme Court. So decision 1803, Marbury versus Madison. And this ultimately turns on whether the Supreme Court has the power to issue a certain writ, which is called the writ of mandamus. The Judiciary Act of 1789 said that it did, but Marshall decides that this law is unconstitutional because the Constitution, in fact, does not give the court that power. Here's Alexander Hamilton, Federalist 78. The interpretation of the laws is the proper and peculiar province of the courts. The Constitution is in fact and must be regarded by the judges as a fundamental law. If there should happen to be an irreconcilable variance between the Constitution and a statute, the Constitution ought to be preferred. Right, Marbury versus Madison, 1803. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. If then the courts are to regard the Constitution, and the Constitution is superior to any ordinary act of the legislature, the Constitution, and not such an ordinary act, must govern the case to which they both apply. Fletcher versus Pect, 1810. This was a trial about whether the state of Georgia could rescind a grant of land that it had made. Could they take it back? So here, this case had begun in the 1790s, and Alexander Hamilton had actually been asked to give an opinion on it as a lawyer. What he wrote in 1795 was, "The Constitution of the United States declares that no state shall pass a law impairing the obligation of contracts. It therefore appears to me that the act of the legislature of Georgia may justly be considered null." John Marshall, 1810. "Georgia is a member of the American Union, and that union has a constitution, the supremacy of which all acknowledge, and which imposes limits to the legislatures of the several states which none claim a right to pass. The Constitution of the United States declares that no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts." McCullough versus Maryland, 1819. This was a trial about whether the state of Maryland could tax a branch of the Bank of the United States. And the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States also came up in court. So here is Hamilton's opinion, 1791, to George Washington on the constitutionality of a national bank. If the end be clearly comprehended within any of the specified powers, and if the measure have an obvious relation to that end, and is not forbidden by any particular provision of the Constitution, it may safely be deemed to come within the compass of the national authority. Marshall, 1819. Let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. Cohens versus Virginia, 1821. This was a case about whether the Cohen brothers, who ran what we would call a financial services business in Baltimore and other places, could they sell lottery tickets from the District of Columbia in Virginia, even though the state had a law against it. And the courts in Virginia had ruled that they couldn't, and they'd also said this decision cannot be appealed to federal courts, because Virginia courts rule on Virginia matters. So in this decision, Marshall quotes Hamilton directly. He calls him a very celebrated statesman. He also says of the Federalist Papers, it is a complete commentary on our Constitution. He quotes Federalist 80. 13 independent courts of final jurisdiction over the same causes is a hydra in government from which nothing but contradiction and confusion can proceed. He also quotes Federalist 82. Here another question occurs. What relation would subsist between the national and state courts in these instances of concurrent jurisdiction? I answer that an appeal would certainly lie from the latter to the Supreme Court of the United States. And finally, Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. This had to do with whether the state of New York could give a monopoly on steamboat navigation of its own rivers. And this is not a direct allusion to something that Hamilton wrote, but I think it has a Hamiltonian flavor. Hamilton writes in Federalist 11, an unrestrained intercourse between the states will advance the trade of each. The veins of commerce in every part will be replenished and will acquire additional motion and vigor from a free circulation of the commodities of every part. Justice Marshall, 1824, the commerce of the United States is that of the whole United States. Every district has a right to participate in it. The deep streams which penetrate our country in every direction pass through the interior of almost every state in the Union and furnish the means of exercising this right. If Congress has the power to regulate it, that power must be exercised wherever the subject exists. And I've been looking back from Marshall to Hamilton, but I want to give one example of looking forward. This again is from McCullough versus Maryland, and Marshall is talking about the government of the Union. He says, the government of the Union, then, is emphatically and truly a government of the people. In form and in substance, it emanates from them. Its powers are granted by them and are to be exercised directly on them and for their benefit. Now that recalls another list of prepositions in the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln got rid of from and on, but he kept of, for, and by, and for. And Marshall's argument here is one of the first appearances of that thought. Now, the last decision I quoted was in 1824. Marshall continues to serve for many more years, but these are years of increasing depression to him. Probably his most famous case from those years, or it's a cluster of cases actually, have to do with the Cherokee Nation. And we're familiar with this now because Marshall's decisions are sympathetic to a nation of American Indians, of Native Americans, and that's, I think, the main reason we think so well of them. And it's certainly the case that Marshall was sympathetic with the Cherokees. But he made his final decision in an 1832 case, and it was purely a matter of national supremacy. The state of Georgia had announced that it would no longer recognize the Cherokee Nation. It would auction off its land. It would forbid missionaries from serving the Cherokees unless they took an oath to the state. Marshall took the position that the federal government had signed treaties with this Indian people, and treaties had precedence over state actions. But nothing came of his decision. It's not true that Andrew Jackson said, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. That's an apocryphal story. But Jackson did say that Marshall's decision has fallen stillborn, that he was not going to do anything to recognize it. And the state of Georgia proceeded to break up the Cherokee landholdings, and they were escorted to Oklahoma, where they were resettled. Marshall wrote in September of 1832, "I yield slowly but reluctantly to the conviction that our Constitution cannot last." He lived for 3 more years. He wrote his epitaph on July 4th, 1835. There's nothing public in it. It's just his birthday, the day he married his wife, and he left a blank for the day he would die. He died 2 days later. The story is that the Liberty Bell was rung for his funeral and received its final crack. And after he died, his dear friend on the court, his colleague Joseph Story, said he was a Federalist of the good old school, of which Washington was the acknowledged leader, and in which he lived and died. So with the death of John Marshall, the last connection, the last personal connection to Washington, and the last direct policy connection is severed. But of course, Washington will continue to march on in American politics, and that will be the theme of my talk in November. Thanks very much. So we have microphones in the aisle if there are any questions. Oh, good, I've answered all questions. Excellent. You know, law decisions, I mean, lawyers could speak for quite a long time. One of the speeches in Burr's treason trial was by a man named Luther Martin. And he was probably the best lawyer in the country at that time, although he was old. He was getting to the end of his career. But he was smart, he was eloquent, he was a shabby dresser. He wore fancy old-fashioned lace cuffs, but they were always dirty. And he was also a lifelong alcoholic. He just drank like a fish, but he was a great courtroom lawyer. And he gave a speech in the Burr trial that lasted 14 hours. So you're lucky. Yes, sir.
Following the Worcester versus Georgia case and the statement, which is apocryphal by Jackson, however, he did take action that indicated that he had no respect for John Marshall in pushing through and signing the Indian Removal Act.
Right. Yes, that's true. Although, you know, it's interesting, he did, when Marshall died, Jackson is still president, and he did give a very gracious send-off to him. It's impressive, and he acknowledges the fact that they had some disagreements on constitutional interpretation, but he, you know, hailed his long service to the nation, and it's a very gracious tribute from a rival.
We need a new book on Marshall.
I'm writing one. Anybody else? No? Well, thank you very much for your attention.